Hi, grandkids. I am going to read you some excerpts from The Pit and the Pendulum. It's too long to read, so I'm going to be shortening it some. It would probably be more fun if, instead of watching this this morning when I have uploaded it, if you keep it and wait until nighttime, maybe shortly before it's time to go to bed, and just crawl in the bed and with one small light on to watch the video by, or none would be better. So I'm going to read this now. The Pit and the Pendulum. All sensations appeared swallowed up in a mad rushing descent as of the soul into Hades. Then silence, stillness, and night. That was what existed. I had swooned, but still all of consciousness wasn't lost. What of it there remained, I will not attempt to define or even to describe. Yet all was not lost. No. In the deepest delirium, in a swoon, no, in death, even in the grave, all is not lost, else there is no immortality. Very suddenly, there came back to my soul motion and sound, the tumultuous motion of the heart, and in my ears the sound of its beating. So far, I had not opened my eyes. I felt that I lay upon my back, unbound. Yet not for a moment did I suppose myself actually dead. Such a supposition, notwithstanding what we read in fiction, is altogether inconsistent with real existence. But where and in what state was I? Upon awakening fully, and stretching forth an arm, I found beside me a loaf and a pitcher with water. I was too much exhausted to reflect upon the circumstance, but ate and drank, and shortly afterward I fell violently on my face. In the confusion attending my fall, I did not immediately apprehend a somewhat startling circumstance, which yet, in a few seconds afterward, and while I still lay prostrate, arrested my attention. It was this: my chin rested upon the floor, but my lips and the upper portion of my head touched nothing. At the same time, my forehead seemed bathed in a clammy vapor, and the peculiar smell of decayed fungus arose to my nostrils. I put forward my arm and shuddered to find that I had fallen at the very brink of a circular pit, whose extent, of course, I had no means of ascertaining at the moment. Groping about the masonry just below the margin, I succeeded in dislodging a small fragment of stone and let it fall into the abyss. For many seconds, I hearkened to its reverberations as it dashed against the sides of the chasm in its descent. At full length there was a sullen plunge into water, succeeded by loud echoes. At the same moment, there came a sound resembling the quick opening and as rapidly closing of a door overhead. While the faint gleam of light flashed suddenly through the gloom and as suddenly faded away, I saw clearly the doom which had been prepared for me, and congratulated myself upon the timely accident of falling by which I had escaped. Another step forward, and the world would have seen me no more, and the death just avoided was of that very character which I had regarded as fabulous and frivolous in the tales respecting the Inquisition. To the victims of its tyranny, there was the choice of death with its direct physical agonies, or death with its most hideous moral horrors. I had been reserved for the latter, but long suffering, my nerves had been unstrung until I trembled at the sound of my own voice, and had become in every respect a fitting subject for the species of torture which awaited me. Shaking in every limb, I groped my way back to the wall, resolving there to perish rather than risk the terrors of the wells of which my imagination now pictured many in various positions about the dungeon. In other conditions of mind, I might have had courage to end my misery at once by a plunge into one of these abysses, but now I was the veriest of cowards. Neither could I forget what I had read of these pits, that the sudden extinction of life formed no part of their most horrible plan. Agitation of spirit kept me awake for many long hours. Upon arousing, I found by my side, as before, a loaf and a pitcher of water. A burning thirst consumed me, and I emptied the vessel. It must have been drugged, for scarcely had I drunk before I became irresistibly drowsy. A deep sleep fell upon me, a sleep like that of death. How long it lasted, of course I know not, but when once again I unclosed my eyes, the objects around me were visible. By a wild, sulphurous luster, the origin of which I could not at first determine, I was enabled to see the extent and aspect of my prison. In its size I had been greatly mistaken. The whole circuit of its walls did not exceed 25 yards. For some minutes this fact occasioned me a world of vain trouble. Vain indeed, for what could be of less importance under the terrible circumstances than what enclosed me? My personal condition had been greatly changed during slumber. I now lay upon my back, and at full length, on a species of low framework of wood. To this I was securely bound by a long strap. It passed in many convolutions about my limbs and body, leaving at liberty only my head and my left arm, to such extent that I could, by dint of much exertion, supply myself with food from an earthen dish which lay by my side on the floor. I saw to my horror that the pitcher had been removed, and I was consumed with intolerable thirst. This thirst, it appeared to be the design of my persecutors to stimulate, for the food in the dish was meat pungently seasoned. Looking upward, I surveyed the ceiling of my prison. It was some 30 or 40 feet overhead, and constructed much as the side walls. In one of its panels, a very singular figure riveted my whole attention. It was the painted figure of Time, as he is commonly represented, except that in lieu of a scythe, he held what, at a casual glance, I supposed to be the pictured image of a huge pendulum, such as we see on antique clocks. There was something, however, in the appearance of this machine which caused me to regard it more attentively. While I gazed directly upward at it, for its position was immediately over my own, I fancied that I saw it in motion. In an instant afterward, the fancy was confirmed. Its sweep was brief and slow. I watched it for some minutes, somewhat in fear, but more in wonder. Wearied at length with observing its dull movement, I turned my eyes upon other objects in the cell. A slight noise attracted my attention, and looking to the floor, I saw several enormous rats traversing it. They had issued from the well, within view to my right. Even then, while I gazed, they came up in troops, hurriedly, with ravenous eyes, allured by the scent of the meat. From this it required much effort and attention to scare them away. It might have been half an hour, perhaps even an hour, for I could take but an imperfect note of time, before I again cast my eyes upward. What I then saw confounded and amazed me. The sweep of the pendulum had increased in extent by nearly a yard. As a natural consequence, its velocity was also much greater. But what mainly disturbed me was the idea that it had perceptibly descended. I now observed, with what horror it is needless to say, that its nether extremity was formed of a crescent of glittering steel, about a foot in length from horn to horn. The horns turned upward, and the under edge evidently as keen as that of a razor. It seemed massy and heavy, tapering from the edge into a solid and broad structure above. It was appended to a weighty rod of brass, and the whole thing hissed as it swung back and forth through the air. I could no longer doubt the doom that was prepared for me. My cognizance of the pit had become known to the inquisitors, the pit whose horrors had been destined for so bold a person as myself, the pit typical of hell, regarded by rumor as the ultimate horror of all their punishments. The plunge into this pit that I had avoided by the merest of accidents, and I knew that surprise or entrapment into torment formed an important portion of all the grotesques of these dungeon deaths. Having failed to fall, it was no part of the demon plan to hurl me into the abyss, and thus, there being no alternative, a different and a milder destruction awaited me. Milder? I smiled in my agony as I thought of such application of such a term. Milder? Long hours of horror, during which I counted the rushing oscillations of the steel, inch by inch, with a descent only appreciable at intervals that seemed ages. Down and still down it came. Days may have passed. It may have been many days that passed before it swept so closely over me as to fan me with its acrid breath. The odor of the sharp steel forced itself into my nostrils. I prayed. I wearied heaven with my prayer for its more speedy descent. I grew frantically mad and struggled to force myself upward against the sweep of the fearful scimitar. That's horrible. And then I fell suddenly calm and lay smiling at the glittering death as a child at some rare toy. There was another interval of utter insensibility. It was brief, for upon again relapsing back into life, there had been no perceptible descent in the pendulum. But it might have been long, for I knew there were demons who took note of my fainting and who could have arrested the descent at pleasure. Upon my recovery, too, I felt very inexplicably sick. And even amid the agonies of that time, the human nature craved food. With painful effort, I outstretched my left arm as far as my hands permitted, and took possession of the small remnant which had been spared me by the rats. As I put a portion of it within my lips, there rushed to my mind a half-formed thought of joy, of hope. Yet what business had I with hope? It was, as I say, a half-formed thought. Man has many such which are never completed. I felt that it was of joy, of hope, but I felt also that it had perished in the mist in its formation. In vain I struggled to regain it. Long suffering had nearly annihilated all my ordinary powers of mind. I was like an imbecile. The vibration of the pendulum was at right angles to my link. I saw that the crescent was designed to cross the region of my heart. It would fray the serge of my robe. It would return and repeat that operation again and again, notwithstanding its terrifically wide sweep, some 30 feet or more, and the hissing vigor of its descent, sufficient to sunder these very walls of iron. Still, the fraying of my robe would be all that for several minutes. It would be accomplished. And at this thought, I paused. I dared not go farther than this reflection. I dwelt upon it with a tenacity of attention, as if, in so dwelling, I could arrest here the descent of the steel. I forced myself to ponder upon the sound of the crescent as it should pass across the garment, upon the peculiar thrilling sensation which the friction of cloth produces on the nerves. I pondered upon all the frivolity until my teeth were on edge. Down, steadily down, it crept. I took a frenzied pleasure in contrasting its downward with its lateral velocity, to the right, to the left, far and wide, with the shriek of a damned spirit, to my heart, with the stealthy pace of the tiger. I alternately laughed and howled as the one or the other idea grew predominant in my mind. Down, certainly, relentlessly down. It vibrated within 3 inches of my chest. I struggled violently, furiously, to free my left arm. This was free only from the elbow to the hand. I could reach my hand from the platter beside me to my mouth with great effort, but no farther. Could I have broken the fastenings about the elbow, I would have seized and attempted to arrest the pendulum. I might as well have attempted to arrest an avalanche. Down, still unceasingly, still inevitably down. I gasped and struggled at each vibration. I shrunk convulsively at its every sweep. My eyes followed its outward or upward whirls with the eagerness of the most unmeaning despair. They closed themselves spasmodically at the descent, although death would have been a relief. How unspeakable! Still I quivered in every nerve to think how slight a sinking of this machinery would precipitate that keen, glistening axe upon my chest. It was hope that prompted the nerve to quiver, the frame to shrink. It was hope, the hope that triumphs on the rack, that whispers to the death-condemned even in the dungeons of the Inquisition. I saw that some 10 or 12 vibrations would bring the steel in actual contact with my robe, and with this observation there suddenly came over my spirit all the keen, collected calmness of despair. For the first time during many hours, or perhaps days, I thought, it now occurred to me that the bandage which enveloped me was unique. I was tied by no separate cord. The first strike of the razor-like crescent across any portion of the band would so detach it that it might be unwound from my person by means of my left hand. But how fearful in that case the proximity of that steel, the result of the slightest struggle, how deadly. Was it likely, moreover, that the minions of the torturer had not foreseen and provided for this possibility? Was it probable that the bandage crossed my bosom in the track of the pendulum? Dreading to find my faint and, as it seemed, my last hope frustrated, I so far elevated my head as to obtain a distinct view of my chest, and the bandage enveloped my limbs and body close in all directions, except right there in the path of the destroying crescent coming down. Scarcely had I dropped my head back into its original position when there flashed upon my mind what I cannot better describe than as the uninformed as half of that idea of deliverance to which I have previously alluded, and of which it only had floated indeterminately through my brain when I raised food to my burning lips. The whole thought was now present, feeble, scarcely sane, scarcely definite, but still entire. I proceeded at once, with nervous energy of despair, to attempt its execution. For many hours, the immediate vicinity of the low framework upon which I lay had been literally swarming with rats. They were wild, bold, ravenous, their red eyes glaring upon me as if they waited but for motionless on my part to make me their prey. To what food, I thought, have they been accustomed to in the well? What horrors! They had devoured, in spite of all my efforts to prevent them, all but a small remnant of the contents of my dish. I had fallen into a habitual seesaw or wave of the hand about the platter, and at length the unconscious uniformity of the movement deprived it of effect. In their voracity, the vermin frequently fastened their sharp fangs on my fingers. With the particles of the oily and spicy juices which now remained, I thoroughly rubbed the bandage wherever I could reach it. Then, raising my hand from the floor, I lay breathlessly still. At first, the ravenous animals were startled and terrified at this change, at the cessation of movement. They shrank alarmedly back. But this was only for a moment. I had not counted in vain upon their voracity. Observing that I remained without motion, one or two of the boldest leaped upon the framework and smelt at my bandages. This seemed the signal for a general rush, for they hurried in fresh troops. They clung to the wood, they overran it, and leaped in hundreds upon my person. The measured movement of the pendulum disturbed them not at all. Avoiding its strokes, they busied themselves with the food-anointed bandage. They pressed, they swarmed upon me. In ever-accumulating heaps, they wreathed upon my throat. Their cold lips sought my own. I was half stifled by their thronging pressure. Disgust, for which the world has no name, swelled up in my bosom, and chilled with a heavy clamminess my heart. Yet 1 minute, and I felt that the struggle would be over. Plainly I perceived the loosening of the bandage. I knew that in more than one place it must be already severed. With a more than human resolution, I kept laying still. Nor had I erred in my calculations, nor had I endured in vain. I at length felt that I was free. The wrapping hung in ribbons from my body, but the stroke of the pendulum already pressed upon my chest. It had divided the wrappings. It had cut through the linen beneath. Twice again it swung, and a sharp sense of pain shot through every nerve. But the moment of escape had arrived. At a wave of my hand, my deliverers hurried tumultuously away with a steady movement, cautious, sidelong, shrinking, and slow. I slid from the embrace of the bandage and beyond the reach of the swinging scimitar. I beheld it drawn up by some invisible force through the ceiling. This was a lesson which I took desperately to heart. My every motion was undoubtedly watched. I was free. I had but escaped death in one form of agony, to be delivered unto worse than death in some other. With that thought, I rolled my eyes nervously around on the barriers of my iron walls that hemmed me in. Something unusual, some change which at first I could not appreciate distinctly, it was obvious, had taken place in the prison. For many minutes of a dreamy and trembling abstraction, I busied myself in vain, unconnected conjecture. During this period, I became aware for the first time of the origin of the sulphurous light which illuminated the cell. It proceeded from a fissure about half an inch in width, extending entirely around the prison, at the base of the walls, which thus appeared and were completely separated from the floor. I endeavored, but of course in vain, to look through the aperture. As I arose from this attempt, the mystery of the alteration in the chamber broke at once upon my understanding. I have observed that although the outlines of figures upon the walls were sufficiently distinct, yet the colors that seemed blurred and indefinite, these colors had now assumed and were momentarily assuming a startling and most intense brilliancy. They gave to the spectral and finished portraitures an aspect that might have thrilled even firmer nerves than my own. Demon eyes of a wild and ghastly veracity glared upon me in 1,000 directions, where none had been visible before, and gleamed with lurid luster of a fire that I could not force my imagination to regard as unreal. Unreal. Even while I breathed, there came to my nostrils the breath of the vapor of heated iron, a suffocating odor pervading the prison. A deeper glow settled each moment in the eyes that glared at my agonies. A richer tint of crimson diffused itself over the pictured horrors of blood. I panted. I gasped for breath. There could be no doubt of the design of my tormentors. Most unrelenting, most demonic men. I shrank from the glowing metal to the center of the cell. Amid the thought of the fiery destruction that impended, the idea of the coolness of the well came over my soul like balm. I rushed to its deadly brink, and through my straining vision below, the glare from the enkindled roof illuminated its inmost recesses, yet for a wild moment did my spirit refuse to comprehend the meaning of what I saw. At length it wrestled its way into my soul. It burned itself in upon my shuddering reason. Oh, for a voice to speak! Oh, the horror! any horror but this. With a shriek, I rushed away from the margin and buried my face in my hands, weeping bitterly. The heat rapidly increased, and once again I looked up, shuddering. There had been a second change in the cell, and now the change was obviously in the form of the cell. As before, it was in vain that I at first endeavored to appreciate or understand what was taking place, but not long was I left in doubt. The inquisitorial vengeance had been hurried by my twofold escape, and there was to be no more dallying with the King of Terrors. The room had been square. I saw that two of its iron angles were now acute. The fearful differences quickly increased with a low rumbling or moaning sound. In an instant, the room had shifted its form into that of an oblong shape, but the alteration stopped not here. I neither hoped nor desired it to stop. I could have clasped the red walls to my bosom as a garment of eternal peace. Death, I said, any death, but that of the pit. Fool! Might I have not known that into the pit it was the object of the burning iron to urge me? Could I resist its glow? Or if even that, could I withstand its pressure? And now, flatter and flatter grew the shape of the walls with a rapidity that left me no time for contemplation. Its center, and of course its greater width, came just over the yawning pit. I shrank back, but the closing walls pressed me relentlessly onward. At length, for my seared and wreathing body, there was no longer an inch of a foothold on the firm floor of the prison. I struggled no more, but the agony of my soul found vent in one loud, long, and final scream. I felt that I tottered upon the brink. I averted my eyes. There was a discordant hum of human voices. There was a loud blast as of many trumpets. There was a harsh grating as of 1,000 thunders. The fiery walls rushed back. An outstretched arm caught my own as I fell fainting into the abyss. It was that of General LaSalle. The French army had entered. The Inquisition was in the hands of the enemies. Oh my word. One of them had grabbed him at the last second as he was falling into the pit and saved him. What horrors he went through. I hate to even think about it. Well, my friends, the story is over, and this Halloween night will soon be over. If you waited until nighttime to watch this, I think it was better that way. And so this is the end of our Halloween together, grandkids. Be well. I hope you sleep okay.